the grey zone and why it matters in this sort of debate we're having today is really about how it shapes the future of military capability, and seeing it from a defence industry perspective, how defence industry needs to evolve to help contribute to our national security. And also, almost by an extension of that, the implications for us as a business as well, and how we operate in the nature of the threats that one would imagine within the context of the grey zone. And then actually just as a British citizen, and what it means for me as an individual and my family, and how we fit within that broader context. So that's I think it's a multi-layered view, perspective I have on this. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, thanks, Ian. And Christina Bayliss, please.
Yes, hello, Christina Bayliss, Global Campaign Director for Training and Mission Rehearsal. And as my title suggests, my focus is really on training, and particularly defense training. And traditionally, when we think about the operating environment for which our armed forces have to prepare for, we think about the usual physical environment, air, land, maritime. What really the gray zone does is challenges that understanding, because now we have to think about the information and the cognitive environment as well when we think about how we prepare for the most likely future threats. So excited to be discussing this during this podcast.
Thank you. And Keith Mallon.
Hi, it's Keith Mallon. I'm the Global Campaign Business Development Leader for Land Information Advantage. My background is, it began with a military background across both combat and intelligence roles. So looking at that nexus of both the physical environment and the information environment. To me, what really characterizes the grey zone is the nature of that constant sub-threshold competition. And what fascinates me is the role that information has to play, the centrality of information, how quickly it can move, and how fundamental it is to shaping narratives of what's happening within that. And that's absolutely central to what we do within the Information Advantage campaign as well.
Thank you, Keith. Okay, so let's have a look at the fact that we've seen an awful lot of debate and discussion around this terminology quite recently. Ian, is grey zone tactics and campaigning, is it actually new, or is it just a new set of words?
It's actually not a new form of words at all. Actually, it was being discussed in the during the Reagan presidency in the US, 20 odd years ago. I mean, is it a new concept? I mean, if you take at the very heart the sort of Sun Tzu philosophy of the acme of skill is winning without fighting, actually the idea of something below the threshold of fighting, it implies that the notion of this has been around for quite a long time. And then frankly, just lily-pad through history, take a couple of examples, maybe things like the privateers in the 16th century and the East India Company just after that. Those are all examples of prevailing in the competitive world of its time without actually going to war. And take a more recent example, and just as a wonder if, if you imagine the fuel tanker drivers' strike in 2000 had actually been state sponsored, maybe it was, who knows, but when you see the sort of things that can happen in the world, and actually if they're being organized and used to achieve an outcome, I think there's a sort of notion of state sponsorship or non-state actor sponsorship of some of these sort of things right throughout history, for millennia, arguably, and therefore, as a new or is it a new thing? Or is it just more of an intellectual concept bringing these things together? I think the danger of that is it can be an unhelpful intellectual concept in so much as trying to create some certainty about something that just doesn't exist in that respect. But I think it does have some valuable aspects to it, not the least of which is reigniting or generating debate around the issue itself and the threats it seeks to highlight and how they get tackled. And therefore the implication of building capabilities to start to address some of those threats. I think also understanding why adversaries take these approaches, and indeed whether we have to do so itself, and then the characterization of it. And I think the modern characterization of it is driven by a number of things. I think the first is about the velocity of information and how that information gets applied to some target audiences and the vulnerabilities of those target audiences based on in many senses, sort of Western liberal democratic values and ideals, and the vulnerabilities created from that. And then the third sort of modern distinction I would perhaps draw around it is the impact of technology, and the way in which technology creates sort of speed, reach, and impact. And for example, cyber, but there are many other aspects to it. So I think, for me, it's not a new concept, but it's got some new characteristics that we need to be much more conscious of, and I think create vulnerabilities that we also need to be much more conscious of. And then just final point is putting it into the sort of military security force domain. I think what it does, it potentially increases significantly the sort of sphere of operations for security and military forces.
Okay, thank you. So one of the things you mentioned was about the velocity of information. So I'd like to just bring Keith in for a second, given your role on information advantage. So are you seeing in your role a higher frequency of those types of activities being prosecuted by adversaries, where information and seeking information advantage is really becoming central to the way in which this kind of grey zone concept is being executed today?
To me, the nature of grey zone is, as I said, it's that nature of competition. And actually what we're seeing that challenging of the normative structures and people pushing against the boundaries as much as possible. And in that sense, grey zone has always existed. It's just about how you challenge the construct in which you exist at any given time. But what allows adversaries to maneuver so effectively within the grey zone is that they can acquire information, they can disseminate information, they can manipulate it, they can change the value of it, they can run counter narratives to it. They are able to manipulate it in all different ways. That can be information as we think of it, as it flows through the comms pipes and you disrupt it via the electronic warfare capability. It can be how you think of things in a cyber sense, or it can be much more about how you propagate a narrative across social media, never mind how you then gather information about an adversary location within a battle space. There are all these different ways in which it can be used and maneuvered. And one of my observations would be that the price of doing that has fallen dramatically as information technology has become so much more prevalent. So there's been a real democratization in capability. And that means that for real capability within a grey zone from an adversary perspective, we're no longer constrained just by peer adversaries. Yeah, although we face peer adversaries and peer plus, you can be into peer minus, non-state actors. You can even be into criminal groups. So the range of threats and how they can then integrate is much, much larger. And that poses a challenge, I think, for those of us who are seeking to defend against those threats.
A question to you, Christina, about ultimately what this means for the kind of defence and security organisations that we're working with on a regular basis. What do these, Ian's talked about this as a relatively perpetual situation, but just it's been changed quite significantly by the advent of new and emerging technologies and a greater velocity of information and a greater prevalence of information as well. So what are the changes that we're seeing in this kind of grey zone environment today? What do they mean for the organizations that that you're involved with on a regular basis?
Yeah, and actually, to be honest, one could not just limit this to one's professional activity. I mean, it is very hard to appreciate how fundamental and ubiquitous the change is that grey zone brings in. And I think the concept of a perennial contest is absolutely the right one. We don't even have the right nomenclature to really describe what it is. This is not conflict as traditionally understood. There's not a single aspect of our lives that is not affected by grey zone. It does not discriminate in terms of the targets. Everyone and everything can be a target. It does not discriminate in relation to the tactics. Anything that would contribute to misinformation, deception, is part of that expanding set of grey zone tactics. It doesn't have a clear timeline. You can't tell when it starts and when it finishes. And I think that's also quite important because there is a shift in objectives. An adversary doesn't need to win in a traditional sense. And it may not even be a single, death, if you will. or kinetic with a K kind of effect, and yet it can be a very successful tactic. So to me, the change is really fundamental because it does bring that technology aspect, which anyone can really master and employ, along with the human dimension, the cognitive dimension. So I think we're facing a completely different environment where our language around conflict, frontline. I mean, what's the frontline with gray zone? There is no frontline anymore because it can be anywhere. So I think we're just at the beginning of really grasping what it means, not just for our defense, but frankly, our societies writ large.
No, it's interesting you talk about the front line being largely indistinguishable from where it was maybe sort of 10, 15 years ago. But you also touched on this concept of kind of human machine teaming that feeds into this. It seems to be quite a prevalent topic within the grey zone discussion. I mean, Ian, you're quite heavily involved in that concept of human machine teaming in a land environment in QinetiQ. Do you see that being a fundamental part of the grey zone challenge for Western nation and Five Eyes nations?
Yes, I think it has a part to play, and it can increasingly have a part to play. But I think actually it touches the been made a number of times now about the impact of technology, because certainly the work we're doing currently, it's human machine teaming in a military context. But I think that teaming with machines is something that's going to be a feature of life going forward in a far broader sense, and increasing, and let's take autonomous cars on the high street in any major city as an example. I think one of the features of that is the element of trust that is created between a human and a machine, and you could see how in a number of circumstances it might be possible to interfere with the way in which stuff operates, thereby driving a wedge in that trust. So I think it's just a small example of how growing human reliance on machines has a number of different aspects to it, and you can see how also that could be upset and interrupted by potential adversaries.
And Ian, one follow-up for you, which is obviously your focus on the land domain, land environment. Same question as I put to Christina. What do you see from the organizations and customers and partners that we're working with in the land space? What do you see from them as their kind of view of what's changing in land?
So I mean, I do think it is the growing understanding of what threat looks like, and therefore the threat vectors that one might imagine on a military force, and then how a military force needs to interoperate with a wider sort of security architecture to enable it to deliver some of its tactical effects in whatever a battlefield looks like. So I think that's the first area. The second is the whole business of the cyber and information domains of worlds, and how military or land forces need to become much more fluent in information operations and influence in that broader sense. And then I think probably the final thing is about how they embrace the technology. And I'll go back to my trust point earlier on about human machine teaming, because it would be quite easy to look at always having to have a completely reversionary mode if you adopt new technology. But actually, there may be layers of technology that can be adopted to create reversionary modes within the adoption of technology. So I think those are some of the aspects that looking at. But I think looking at our land customers is they also recognize that the role of armies or land forces in the future is absolutely to be able to engage on a human-to-human basis, and I think that starts to break down some of the uncertainty around where the threats from a sort of grey zone sub-threshold sense come from.
Okay, thank you. Keith, question for you. We see quite a lot of narrative, I think, about the threat from modern adversaries and the challenges we face having to deal with those. Why is it always played out that the adversaries are so much better at this than we are?
Great question. I think that in the first instance, I do not accept either on a personal level or as an intellectual concept, that adversaries are, it's axiomatic that adversaries are better at operating the grey zone. We have choices, we have capabilities, we have skills, we have advantages, and we can bring those to bear. That said, there are advantages that our adversaries have within the grey zone. And now we could do this just as much as them, but the advantages that I think they can tend to play with. I think one is around legality and risk. So we live in an incredibly litigious society. And on top of that, we live in a society where risk has really been driven out. And that's mirrored in our acquisition processes, in terms of how we shape our doctrine, in terms of how we operate. You know, we work in a very rules-based order. And what that means is that you could be a small insurgent force, or you could be a peer plus adversary who fancies picking a fight with us, and you are not going to be bound by the same rules that we bind ourselves by. Which means that you may, as an adversary, be more willing to take a risk and try a novel tactic, technique, or procedure. You may want to implement something a bit more novel than we do. Or it may be that the slightly more risky committing of forces, you know, putting in deniable proxy forces, the idea of border incursions, the idea of manipulating information relatively overtly, that may well be something that some of our adversaries have a much higher risk appetite for than we do. And there's some practical examples of this. So, for instance, the rock star of Russian unmanned system capability in the ground environment was the Uran-9. Now, they deployed that to Syria. And lo and behold, a very early stage prototype unmanned ground vehicle did not fare particularly well in a real live shooting contest against a very determined adversary. And having worried an awful lot of people for a long time about this UGV capability, there were quite a number of people on social media from the UK defence world who were crowing and very excited to hear about the stories leaking out about it being jammed and the weapon not firing. And I took a completely different view to that, completely different. I said, look at the risk they've just taken. They've taken something to combat. Okay, they've used it in a very limited way. They've learned very valuable lessons about how they are able to employ that capability. And then they've taken it back and they've made it better. And some of that may have just been narrative working, like, you know, look at the scary Russians with their robot, and maybe it was just a deception effort, or maybe they were actually willing to take a risk and innovate a bit faster and do that around information systems. So I think that balance of risk is really interesting. I think the other thing is that, like any commodity, be it gold, be it silver, be it wheat, whatever it might be, the more there is of something, the harder it is to find value. And I think in the ubiquity of information and with so many different sources, it becomes much easier for adversaries to undermine trust and to devalue something. So actually, you know, one of the great promises of, you know, the World Wide Web and internet was that it was going to bring truth. It was going to bring information into the darkest corners of the world. Well, actually what it did was it flooded it with a huge amount of misinformation, of information from competing sources. So all of a sudden there is no single version of the truth anymore. Everything is open to challenge. And I think, you know, Ian talked about attack vectors and he talked about trust. I think that's a massive issue that adversaries are very capable of exploiting, of being able to run counter-narrative misinformation and actually devalue what it is that we hold within the West as being trustful.
Okay, thank you. And would either of the other panelists like to come in on that? Why do we perceive, to take up Keith's point, that modern adversaries are better at grey zone campaigning than we are? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, happy to join on this, Richard. I would be a bit less positive, I guess, than Keith on this. I think right now we are losing because our adversaries have been longer at this, and they've been absolutely strategically focused on this as a tactic. And as an ultimate end to a large extent. I think it's telling that former senior GCHQ official recently said during a Sky News podcast that we are losing here because they're targeting the unconventional. And we don't understand haven't yet grabbed how to really work in that area where you have conventional and unconventional happening at the same time. The second aspect, and that builds up a bit on what Keith said, yes, we have all those rules and ethical norms that tie us down. I think the problem is that, you know, in democracies, it's far more messy. You know, having an integrated response and being able to to operate at pace is quite a challenge. And while it is our biggest strength, in many ways it is our weakness. How do you really operate not just stealthily, but at pace in an integrated way, which frankly within a democracy it's very hard to do.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to push another question to Ian now, which is about the implications for defence and security more broadly, and this kind of need to bring those two areas together. So we talked in the report about the integration of defence and security capabilities in organisations and how important that's going to be to countering the grey zone challenge. Would you first of all, would you agree with that? And I'm very aware that you don't have to agree with that just because it was a statement made in our own literature. But do you agree with that? And if you do agree with that, are you seeing ways in which that's happening at the moment? So I'll put that first to Ian and then offer out to Keith and Christina.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And I think, I think the conversation we've had so far sort of rather highlights the problem of looking at this is purely in a defence and security sense. And it, it's sort of come out a number of times, well, I guess it's at the heart of this is the vulnerabilities, and therefore protecting vulnerabilities, because security as a blanket concept is very broad. So I think if we see this as protecting ourselves against those threat vectors, I think my own personal perspective is that we need to see this as sort of three different levels in terms of our response and the integration of those. The first is almost that national level, let's take it governmental level, and the integration really required there is about detection of these threats to the degree possible, and then cross-government and national resilience against these threats. And I think that's where the integration effort is probably most important. Linked to that is also the response around trying to create a version of the truth to the degree it can be achieved, and therefore creating trust within that sort of national level. And frankly, we just need to look at the experience during the COVID-19 pandemic of the challenges of creating truth or having truth about that. And I would say the third thing at the national level, I think again, the integration is I think we tend to see this as a very very defensive sense. And I think going back to the previous comment about the nature of our governance and governments means it's quite hard to be too aggressive about this. But this doesn't need to be a wholly defensive posture. So at national governmental level is the opportunity to go after this at source, if you like, to take an offensive posture. I think the second level down is, let's call it the institutional level, whether that's public sector, private sector organizations. And I think the integration required there is about threat awareness and resilience, and making sure that there is joined up activity there. And things like the National Cybersecurity Centre, for example, help contribute to that. But it is definitely more than just the cyber domain that we should be concerned about. And so there's a joined uppness around skills and training and education about these sort of threats. And then the last level, and I touched this in my introduction, one of the things that I look at is the personal level, the individual citizen level, which is also about having that awareness and the personal security there. But also then how does a nation train its citizens to be aware of this as a threat, and therefore not to get the sort of reactions that one sees in the aftermath of political rallies or other sort of significant news events. And so there's a training and a behaviours and education about that, and perhaps at an individual level degree of skepticism about information that does fly around at the velocity we're talking about.
And I'm gonna build on that question a little bit for Keith and Christina. I mean, what Ian's touched on there is this coming together of defence and security fields, sectors, environments, however we want to describe it, and the melding of those capabilities. But those are often going to be in response to what I think we would see as common challenges for those types of organisations and those types of forces. So in the report, we look at some of those common challenges. Are there any of those common challenges that you'd like to highlight here in this discussion that you think are really prevalent and worth noting, that will undoubtedly force that kind of coalition of defence and security?
I think the challenge, one of the things that we've called out here, and Ian used the example of pandemic response, and I'd imagine most people on the call are aware that, you know, the military aid to civil powers throughout COVID-19 in the UK has been quite substantial. But one of the things that has changed, of course, is a data-driven response to that. And there have been some projects within defence where you look at combining multiple tens of different unstructured data sources, bringing them together in order to predictively assess where a response might be required. But actually, in doing that, we face some of those same legal, regulatory, and even technical challenges that I talked about under your previous question. And actually, you then start to get into questions about privacy. You start to get into questions about security, how you protect and assure data, about how you then present it and share it, and about how you manage it such that it doesn't absolutely overwhelm an operator, somebody who's trying to make a commander who's trying to make a specific decision. And for me, I think it's incumbent upon organizations like QinetiQ and all the rest of us in industry to be able to lean in and help answer those things with tangible actions, rather than just sit there in that ethereal domain and say we should share information. Actually, we are the ones who have to help break down those technical barriers, those work with the regulatory bodies to give them the confidence and the assurance that these challenges can be met and that you can integrate multiple sources of information and present them safely and coherently. But I also think we then have to look towards the future and think about what more we can do with that, because information is proliferating throughout all of our environments. There are sensors, there are modalities, there are things coming in all of the time. And actually, if we sit back, we will just end up sitting here in this deluge of information. That although it can be very useful to bring it all together, we have to do that in a really coherent and well thought through way. Otherwise, we just get back into the same problem of overwhelming people. But if we can break that down, I think that if we can tackle that problem, well, then I think bringing the information together from across government rather than just from defence is incredibly powerful and incredibly exciting.
And Christina, the role that you play here at QinetiQ is obviously very focused on training, mission rehearsal, and would you see that kind of skills development side of the grey zone challenge for Western and Five Eyes nations to be something that's common across defence and security organisations?
Yes, certainly. When we're talking about cyber operations or information operations, I mean, that really cuts across the military and the civilian realms. And in order to think about how an adversary might apply those kind of tactics, you do need different skills, a different mindset. And this is where we can't work in silos. We absolutely depend on bringing that expertise together across all of those areas, including industry. I mean, there's a lot of commercial companies in the technology space that have a lot of experience in this. And so absolutely, I mean, I think we probably have to completely revisit, how we train our people because of that cognitive and operational aspect that I mentioned earlier. This is not just enough. It's not enough to just being able to, do your work the traditional way, the procedural type of training that you would do just in order to be, a good pilot or tank commander, whatever it might be. You really need to be able to cope in an environment that deals with the multiplicity of threats, conventional, unconventional, above the threshold. And in fact, it may never go above the threshold. So how do you really, infuse essentially your training in such a way that you're ready in that gray zone? I think that's a really hard question. And again, it goes back to how do we define conflict moving forward? I think we're still struggling really to understand what that is, when you may not be able or don't need to fire anything in order to achieve your strategic objectives, which might be, confusion, it might be all sorts of other things. What's the role of the military in that context? It has to be really rethought completely.
So,
Richard, can I just add something? I think it does fit within this, and maybe it's a little bit of a build on Christina's point there, which is the whole business of actually understanding when you've been attacked, if that word in this context is completely irrelevant. And therefore understanding what your response is going to be. And I think there's a broader point here, but what does modern deterrence look like in this sort of circumstance? I know it gets debated regularly in security and defense bodies about deterrence and what constitutes attack, and Article 5, the NATO Article 5 about collective defense. But I do think in the spirit of not just sitting and marching around the problem, but actually how do you resolve this? How do you solve it? I do think there's a place for wargaming, experimentation, for training and mission rehearsal, almost at the strategic level of decision making. And those of a certain vintage will recall exactly those sort of strategic level training exercises during the Cold War to determine what responses would and should be. And I do think that's quite an important feature going forward, because actually the way to resolve some aspects of ambiguity is to practice for it. And of course, that's what happens at tactical training. But I think almost the challenges are becoming increasingly operational and strategic level, if that terminology is still completely relevant.
Richard, if I may jump just on this one word that Ian mentioned, ambiguity. I think that is at the heart of things, because what is the gray zone? You live in ambiguity. It's not the same thing as uncertainty. It's being able to kind of operate in ambiguity and use it in your benefit. And our training, our education, in many ways is quite predictable. It's repetitive. Yes, we're talking about making our training more immersive and more representative. Maybe we need to be making it more ambiguous, more unpredictable, because that's the mindset, that's the kind of the cognitive state that we need to be there when we get an attack that we can't immediately relate to something we've experienced previously, particularly if it is of a hybrid nature. So it is fundamental in terms of how we're approaching, again, not just in the defense world, but certainly the defense world is even more, I guess, acute because, I guess, of the way we've always been used to addressing conflict and contest.
So this brings in a really interesting point that's raised in the Q&A, actually. So I'm actually going to bring in one of the questions from one of our attendees. So Alex Fuchs says, he refers to the concept of the rainbow zone, which I thought was quite a nice idea, where you start bringing in more cognitive and ethical dimensions at the expense of kinetics. And I think that kind of feeds into what you're suggesting, which is that the nature of the kind of threats that we face are becoming less kinetic and more cognitive. And therefore, the way in which we have to respond to that is equally to do the same. So do you see training and skills development having a much higher focus on cognitive requirements even in the next 2 to 5 years, let alone the next 10 to 15?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, many of our customers are facing this and talking about this as we speak. This is not new. It's just has obviously reached a level with all the gray zone developments that it has to be addressed. Often, of course, the challenge is that not enough time is spent on training because it's considered something that takes time away from other things. So we have to rethink also, what's this training mean? How do you do it when you do it? It has to be kind of a perennial operational mindset. And again, we have to find ways to train without saying, I'm going to set aside now a week to train those skills that I've learned. So I think it's far more fundamental, that the challenge that we're facing. It's not just how we design the training, but how we conduct it in the context of something that should be the continuum between, operations and training.
And I do think, if I may, just to pick up on that, is there's a training dimension to this, but there is very much an education aspect to it. And I know in the UK, the whole notion of the part that information operations, information maneuver plays in military capability is becoming increasingly strong. But I do think there's a sort of cultural, philosophical view to it. If you're training somebody to, kill an enemy or defeat a position or take a hill or whatever it is, everything will be couched in a certain way. But I think increasingly, and lots of people get this, I know, but is actually, how do you use military force without actually using kinetic energy as a force, as part of that force? For example, and certainly having been involved in an info ops type role in the past, I used to say that, you know, driving an armoured brigade hard and fast from A to B without firing a shot should be having a cognitive effect. So actually, how you're exploiting that. Now, that's a very sort of tactical military example, perhaps, but you know, if you go back to Gulf War, you know, 30th anniversary of the manoeuvres around the Gulf War, you had TV and radio broadcasts from a certain part of the country to create a cognitive effect in the adversary, and then you were manoeuvring forces around to do different things, and it's the culture that's inherent in that needs to become much more prevalent, I think, in this grey zone, and the sub-threshold activity, I think, is really where the education and training needs to lead in a military context.
Yeah. And that must, sorry, Christine, and that must sort of ring true with you, Keith, just because in that field of information advantage, it would imply that it is all cognitive rather than kinetic. Is that true, or is that a misnomer?
No, I completely disagree, because I think that the land environment still retains its physical characteristic, and I think the whole point of creating an information advantage is that it still has to translate into an effect in the physical environment as well. So to me, it's true of all the domains, but I think it's especially true of land, is that you have that interplay between the physical and the cognitive, and that can go either way. So it can be that you can be holding a position on the ground, but that all of the locals around you completely resent your presence and you have lost the information battle. So therefore, the fact that you've held the ground means absolutely nothing, because you have to keep on holding it because you've lost that cognitive battle space. But similarly, it means that if you employ the right information effect, you don't actually need to be physically present. Or it could be that you can combine both, as Ian suggested, both physical effect and cognitive effect. So to me, that is one of the challenges. And I don't think this is true specifically of grey zone. I think it's true of all conflict, is that it's the interplay between the physical and the cognitive and the virtual. That's where it goes. That's the real magic. And I think it's what, to me, it comes down to a concept of how you want to operate or how you want to fight. You need to know what way you're responding to. It has to be threat driven, because otherwise you're kind of just running around and having effects and hoping for the best. Well, actually, you're doing stuff, but you're not necessarily having effect. You need to think about the threat of what you're trying to overcome, and that will always be that interplay between physical and cognitive.
Yeah, I will just build on this and maybe just be a bit provocative, I guess, is I totally agree with Keith that you will always have a physical element. The challenge we're facing is if you look at the way we define objectives, and therefore that defines a lot of how we train for certain things, they all have a physical effect. It is about learning how to do maneuver, how you take the hill, how you capture the enemy. But the objective maybe should be, how do you spread confusion? How do you have a different effect that is not physical? And that then triggers a whole different set of scenarios and training that one will have to do. You might use physical tactics to get there, but the effect is not a physical effect. And I think that's the part, as I said, I think we're still at the beginning of kind of understanding how we're going to cope with this, because that's how adversaries operate.
I would agree with that. I think the day that somebody says, you're in phase 1 and it says, would you like to perform a section attack on that hill? Or would you like to incite that local mob to go and cause those soldiers in that occupying position no end of grief? I think that would really start to show tactical growth.
Exactly.
So, but I do think, lifting this back up to that sort of broader strategic view of grey zone. I think the challenge looking at grey zone from a sort of national perspective, and it's quite easy with respect to my colleagues, and I'm guilty of myself of picking tactical examples. But the benefit of the tactical examples we've given it is you're using military force without necessarily firing a shot, but to demonstrate the physical potential of force. The challenge you then have is if you've got, let's take interference with elections, or maybe the hypothetical interference with the fuel tanker drivers, and their striking behaviour in the past. If there's interference with those things to create a negative outcome for our country, how do you then connect that with the potential use of force as the retaliation means? So how do you retaliate to that? When do you know that the threshold has been crossed to actually respond in a certain way? In a Western democratic alliance, how do you create responses fast enough that will have the desired effect on a potential adversary? Whether it's sanctions or whatever.
And I'll bring in another of Alex Fuchs's points here, because it's in the same question and it hasn't really been tackled yet, and it is provocative as well, which is that he talks about the ethical dimension. Now, we often label a lot of the tactics used by modern adversaries as unethical and crossing ethical thresholds. In order to Ian's point about how do we craft responses, to craft and deliver effective responses to unethical attacks, do we have to cross ethical boundaries ourselves? That is a deliberately provocative question.
Yeah, so I think what we've done is to create some norms for our society, and as a society and as a collection of societies with an alliance. I suppose the one thing that conflict in the 20th century did was to move those norms around a little bit. And I think as we look at the nature of conflict and sub-conflict thresholds, we need to be clear what the new norms might be in that sense. So, and that's a bit of an equivocal answer, but I think we need to test some of these, because otherwise we could find ourselves operating with one arm tied behind our back. And I'm most certainly not saying throw the rule books out the window, but the rules of the game are evolving and changing. So do we need to evolve and change our responses, or the way in which we respond, or aspects of the way in which we respond? I think we do need to challenge these, and these will be tough conversations. But frankly, one only needs to look across the Atlantic to see some of the corollary of different societal behaviours to the accepted norms of that society. Something that does need to be explored further. I feel sure that on this webinar we're not going to solve that problem.
No, I think that's probably true, especially with the time that we have, and that's kind of a timely point in itself. We're just about to eat in a little bit to our Q&A time, and we have got some good questions that have been thrown up here in the chat and in the Q&A section. So before we go to those, very, very briefly, I'm going to ask each of you a very, very simple summary question. From the view of an organization that sits as a commercial operation, but within the kind of defense and security community, what would you advise the defense community to think about changing, defense and security communities think about changing, in summary, in relation to what we're seeing in terms of grey zone threats today? So I think we'll go Keith first. What's your advice to the defense and security community in a nutshell?
Despite the fact that I am somebody who works with the military to sell technology solutions to them, my number one thing is to say technology can't solve your strategic problems. Can't do it. But what we can do is that we can work with you to figure out what is the threat that you face and define a new concept of how you want to operate or to fight. And we can then put a technology solution around that. I think I would be vehemently against a tech fascination, and I would be vehemently against any suggestion that technology can solve these problems. They can contribute, but they must sit within the right operating or fighting framework.
Okay, and Christina, what's your advice out to the industry and in particular to the defense and security community?
Yeah, actually, very similar to what Keith just said. I think there is a risk that AI is now this new nirvana or silver bullet everybody's aiming for. The reality is that if we don't accept the importance of the people dimension, we talked about all the cognitive aspects, we're going to miss the trick. We absolutely depend on technology, and we will need to exploit it. But this is absolutely not a technological contest, if you will. And it is more broadly about building resilience into everything we're doing.
Okay, and Ian, your view?
Yeah, I think I'll take a slightly more conceptual view. I think we need to be really careful, or the community needs to be really careful not spending too long tightly defining the concept actually look at more and just get on with those more practical solutions. And I think either through experimentation, certainly through training and further education at all the different levels, national level, institutional level, and the individual personal level also.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to pull a few questions from the Q&A because there are quite a few here. We've got a little bit of time. So let's take one from Vishali Odedra. I hope that I pronounced that correctly. So this is about the vaccination rollout, the COVID situation. We touched on this slightly. Has anybody seen anything that they would class as a kind of grey zone tactic during the vaccination process and during, let's broaden it out, during the COVID-19 pandemic that demonstrates that sowing seeds of mistrust and confusion is still quite prevalent, even in this most serious of healthcare crises?
Yeah, I mean, just to take a really immediate example, just on the wireless this morning, they were talking about the WhatsApp message going around elements of the BAME community about an alternative medicine solution to coronavirus, and in one circumstance that was, in fact, I think it probably was just a well-meaning but misguided alternative therapist offering an idea. But actually, at another level, that could easily have been something that was deliberately sown into that community to spread distrust about the government and the government messages. So you can see how right across the board these sort of things can happen, and there's all sorts of negative messages flying around about vaccinations, about what you need to do to protect yourself from the virus and all the rest of it. So I think COVID has highlighted a number of these sort of things.
I think there are two things that I would point out to Richard. One is more about COVID, and the Chinese state media were engaged in extensive efforts to discredit theories that the virus originally came from Wuhan. That was a coordinated information campaign that ran for some time. It's subsequently been discredited, but certainly it has managed to protect their own narrative amongst a key target audience for them. The second thing is that there were numerous reports in the press so this is open source reported, of state actors attempting to attack academic institutions and pharmaceutical companies to steal via cyber means vaccine development technology and secrets. Now that is grey zone activity, if nothing else. Granted, it may not be to gain a military operational advantage, but it is absolutely about encroaching upon what should be sovereign space by another power in order to increase the security of a foreign population. And that is absolutely grey zone activity to me.
Yeah, the other two examples I would offer is the famous or less famous monkey vaccine. Obviously, that was a significant campaign of disinformation aimed against the Oxford vaccine. And now ongoing as well is information about how vaccines are unsafe, which obviously is a bit harder to attribute to specific sources, but that again can create a lot of uncertainty and confusion and disrupt plans to vaccinate the population.
Okay, thank you. We'll take another question in the chat. This one's about the relationship between commercial and defence sectors. Can they be seen as the natural ally of modern deterrence in the same way as Finland and the various Nordic and Baltic states have a greater community and political acceptance of industry to support civil and civic efforts to protect the national interest? So can industry and the commercial defence sector work together to support civic efforts to protect national interest? Are we seeing that coming together across commercial and civil?
Yeah, I mean, I'll have a shot first, but I think there's a broader whole, let's call it a whole force approach to addressing these particular issues anyway, for two reasons. First, I think the defence and security, the governmental defence and security instruments, can't do their work without support from industry, and that that's inherent in the defence and security industry strategy and everything that talks about. But the second point, probably maybe less familiar or less obvious to many people, is actually a lot of these defence and security industries need to be better at protecting themselves for the intrusions of the sort that Keith talked about earlier on. And so, unless you see this as a whole team effort, you're going to undermine your security. And one thing, the defence and security chain is probably only as strong as its weakest link. And somewhere in the supply chain, you're going to have that weak link.
I'm going to throw in a final question from the chat. So this is from Nathan Athy, who says, can you convince your customers, or actually, how do you convince customers to open up their minds to ideas that might be considered unorthodox, but could possibly lead to better results on the field? So Keith, do you want to take that one first as somebody who's involved in the prototype warfare campaign?
I would say that there's actually quite a high appetite amongst customers to look at unorthodox solutions. I think if one were to walk to any of the trial and development units, to any of the most of the areas of DSTL, and to many parts of the HQs of any of the frontline commands, there's no real resistance to unorthodox ideas being generated. I think the challenge is accelerating the adoption of unorthodox ideas so that they can actually find their way from an experimental environment into an operationally deployed environment. I think that's the real challenge. And I think you have to address a wide range of pan-defense lines of development. So you have to look at the training, the education, the people, the equipment, the information. I suppose you've got to look at that through life sense. And that can be really difficult. And I think it also comes back to one of my earlier points about safety and regulation as well. We have an acquisition system that is extremely good at driving out risk, but it does so at the expense of time and cost. So things tend to be quite slow and quite expensive. Whereas the rapid acquisition is something that we are only starting to get our heads around. Now, we have made great strides in that in recent years, but we are still get to see operational deployment certainly in land, of a lot of the exciting things that have been experimented with. And that's almost despite all the valiant efforts of a large number of people who've been really trying to push that through. It's still just intrinsically a difficult system to get innovation and unorthodox ideas through. I think the appetite is there. I think we just all collectively have to understand what our risk appetite is and how we accelerate things.
Yeah, and I would share Keith's point, is that there is a sort of quite a swell of view that of willingness to address some of these things. So I think what industry can do, what QinetiQ specifically can do, is to help create the environment in which some of these ideas can be developed, experimented with, and tested. And that famous sort of cultural point people make, which is readiness and a willingness to fail on occasions as well, and create the safe environment in which that fail can happen. But I think there does need to be that it's almost sort of connecting to the top end of the defence and security community, a much more explorative way of trying to address some of these issues, i.e. getting from admiring the problem or understanding the problem to starting to take some actions about it as well. So I think the second thing I think industry can help with, and it's then that wider integration role, is to help connect defence and security organisations and the architectures that will enable the responses that we've touched on earlier in this session.
Yeah, one thing I would add to all of this is that it is about how we reconstitute the partnership between government, including defense, and industry. And it's also how we address risk within that. Keith talked about the risk adversity that has traditionally characterized this space. I think this is about, if it's a true partnership, is how do we share the risk, because it is something that we all obviously recognize, and it has to be a truly collaborative effort. And there are some very good examples of this. Certainly, the environment has changed fundamentally to what anyone in the defense and the government space would have known over the past 20 years.
Okay, thank you all very much. So we're just about out of time. We've got just a couple of minutes left. So I'd just like to take the opportunity to say thank you very much to Christina, to Ian, to Keith for joining the discussion and leading the debate. And thank you to the attendees who've posed some interesting and challenging questions and for listening in. This won't be the last of these that we do. We will look at doing it on this topic and extending the conversation. A couple of the suggestions in the Q&A have been to look at a more pragmatic rather than conceptual approach to some of these conversations. We can certainly do that. But we'll also look at other topics that are of interest to the people, not just on this call today, but who engage with us on social media. So thank you very much to Ian Harrison, Christina Bayliss, and to Keith Mallon. And thank you very much for joining us. Have a very good afternoon, everybody.